So on this channel, I've spent a lot of time talking about Bernie Sanders, and one of the common themes has been how the media misleads people on Bernie Sanders. They mislead people about Bernie Sanders' worldview, his policies, his campaign, and on and on and on. But one of the ways they mislead people about Bernie Sanders is perhaps the most insidious. And I've noted this before. They mislead people about Bernie by simply ignoring Bernie. There are times when they'll talk about him, often in a negative frame, but then there are many other moments where they just don't mention him. They don't criticize him because they ignore him. And there was that famous example earlier on in the race where they listed some polling results and they listed Biden in first and then Warren and Harris in third and fourth. And that whole narrative was, who's in second? I guess he doesn't exist. It's not worth mentioning. And of course, that person was Bernie. And the whole point was to create a headline that gave a perception of a race that did not include Bernie Sanders. The guy in second didn't merit mentioning because he's not a credible candidate, he's not electable, and because he's not electable, we shouldn't mention him. And that's the kind of circular logic the media is trying to create and perpetuate. The media tries to create success and create failure by who they spotlight and who they don't spotlight. Pete Buttigieg's rise is in part due to the fact that he got coverage in excess of what he actually deserved given his notoriety and his polling. And that increased coverage led to polling increases, which in turn helped the media justify increased coverage for Buttigieg. You can see how the neoliberal press works. And this recent example on PBS Newshour is really illustrative. It's too long of a clip to play here. I'll post a link in the description, but it's a report about the Democratic primary focusing on Iowa, because Iowa is the first state that's going to be voting in the primary process, and Iowa is incredibly important because a win in Iowa or a strong performance in Iowa can help you build some momentum into the later states and help you win the nomination and maybe ultimately the presidency. So Iowa is very important. And in this report, they talk about lots of people. Of course, they talk about Biden and Warren. They're two of the front runners. They get a lot of coverage here. They even talk about Buttigieg, the candidate who, at least in some polls, is rising. They also talk about people who are struggling, polling very low. They briefly mention Cory Booker. They play a clip of Kamala Harris. And they even have time to mention people like Bullock and Sestak, people who have recently dropped out of the race, people who are no longer running. But in all of this, they find no time to mention Bernie Sanders, the man that in most polls in the polling averages is in second place. The man who is, bringing a unique vision to this process. The man who is bringing massive crowds wherever he goes in Iowa and across the country. And they do not have time to mention him, nor do they show a picture or, B-roll of him either. Bernie Sanders is utterly non-existent in this campaign recap narrative. And again, they don't criticize him. They don't say Bernie Sanders is unelectable. They just ignore him. And this is what a lot of people call manufacturing consent. It's the way the media, through what they talk about and what they don't talk about, can help to build political realities, not just reflect them, not just report on them, not even just perpetuate them, but to actually construct them proactively. And so you do this by giving Pete Buttigieg more coverage than he ever deserved early on in the process. They tried to do the same thing with Beto O'Rourke, and that failed. And now they're trying to do it with Buttigieg. They're finding some success, but maybe not sufficient amount of success to bring him into that top tier. And so with Bernie, who's pushing a unique vision, they just don't mention him. It's not a coincidence. It's not an accident. Bernie Sanders was left out here on purpose. That was a deliberate decision by the PBS Newshour team, the reporters who did the segment, the people who spoke about the segment and the race afterwards. It was a deliberate effort to ignore one of the frontrunner candidates who's bringing a vision that challenges the political and social and economic status quo. It's understandable that not every single candidate can get mentioned. There's multiple people running. There's still more than a dozen, I believe, that are technically in this race. But to ignore Bernie Sanders, one of the frontrunners, is inexcusable. And it's not an accident. Again, I can't underline that enough. The whole point here is to perpetuate a narrative. If you don't mention Bernie, then people who are undecided, who are maybe lower information voters, won't think about Bernie. If they don't think about Bernie, they won't declare their allegiance to Bernie. And then you can help create a polling scenario where Bernie, relative to the candidates that do get mentioned consistently, whether it's Biden or Warren, or even people far below Bernie like Buttigieg and Harris and Booker or Klobuchar, they all get mentions, but Bernie Sanders doesn't, and it creates this polling imbalance. It's not necessarily going to work. Despite this concerted effort to perpetuate Bernie blindness, whether it's in this source, whether it's in this instance or in others, Bernie Sanders continues to poll well. He has the most dedicated base of support. He's raised incredible amounts of money from small donors. He leads amongst money raised and amount of donors and in the geographic spread of those donors. Bernie Sanders' campaign is still very successful. And Bernie Sanders, I think, is still in an excellent position to win this primary. But it won't be due at all to media coverage. And if anything, it'll be in spite of media coverage. If Pete Buttigieg wins this, he will owe his victory almost entirely to a perpetuated media narrative that made him into a candidate when he was just a mayor of a small town and a failure of a mayor at that. That's what created Pete Buttigieg, is people saying, hey, Pete Buttigieg could win. Bernie Sanders never got that. Bernie Sanders got ignored at best and harshly criticized and unfairly criticized at worst, and often a combination thereof. Bernie Sanders will get mentioned when, a poll is bad for Bernie. They'll be like, oh, Bernie Sanders has to drop out of this race. But when things look good for Bernie, the media's not there to cover it. At least not consistently. At least not in the same way that they would cover Biden or Buttigieg or Harris or even Warren. It's just the political reality. Because here's the thing, Bernie Sanders' positions are unequivocally popular. Bernie Sanders himself is very popular. Bernie's positions on Medicare for all, on free university, on taxing the rich, on helping working class people, on challenging economic autocracy, all of these things are popular. But they're not popular with the people who run the media, either the corporations who own the media or the upper middle class, intelligentsia who doesn't support Bernie Sanders' plan, and they are the ones, the media personalities, the media figures. Those groups don't tend to support Bernie Sanders' vision for a radical economic and social democracy emerging in the United States. They just don't support it. And so they can't really criticize him all that effectively. When you go at Bernie, it just makes him look better. When you have some rich person telling you, here's why you don't deserve medication and here's why you don't deserve to go to the doctor, it backfires on them. So the best way to attack Bernie when Bernie is popular and his policies are popular is to not mention Bernie, to try, even though it might be ineffective, to suck the oxygen out of the Bernie campaign. If Bernie's campaign is a roaring fire, sometimes you try to put out a fire by dousing it, but other times you put out a fire by starving it of the oxygen it needs to perpetuate. And with Bernie, I think they realize that you can't douse a progressive, groundswell fire with tired neoliberalism. Maybe the only way you can do it is by ignoring it and hoping it just goes away. I don't think that's going to happen, but that's very clearly what the media is trying to do. They don't support Bernie's plan, but they know the people do. If they give Bernie coverage, it'll ultimately benefit Bernie because people will see through it. People aren't dumb. Americans are not dumb. This narrative that the people, don't know their own interests is wrong. They just haven't been shown a politician that actually stands for their interests on most of the issues that matter to them. That's why Bernie Sanders cannot be allowed to get consistent media coverage unless it's expressly negative, and even that has been shown to backfire. So keep all of this in mind. Keep a keen eye when you watch the media. Don't just look at what they say. What they say matters. But often, what the media does not say, what they omit, is the real story. And with Bernie Sanders, we see that time and time again.